we go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session. This session is, and subsequent sessions are going to be different from the previous three. Just we're dealing with a different subject matter, and I hope it's to be more interactive. The last three sessions definitely felt much more like a kind of frontal presentation and a lecture of the as they were called, the great ideas and ages of the Jewish experience, and a lot of that, frontal presentation of what covering the great periods and the great ideas to come out of those periods from ancient times up to the contemporary period. But the next several sessions are going to focus on practice, on the behaving aspect of Judaism. And so I hope that you feel compelled to ask questions and are want to share experiences or have specific questions. The reading is certainly lighter, and there's more about the how we do things as opposed to what we've been covering the last several sessions. So what I want to cover tonight is, in general terms, halacha, mitzvot, and two major categories of those, Shabbat and kashrut. And I'll get to why in a few moments. Two important words, halacha and mitzvot. First off, halacha is often mistranslated as Jewish law. However, the word halacha comes from the Hebrew root lalechet, meaning to walk or to go. And it derives from a couple of places in the book of Deuteronomy where we are commanded lalechet bidrachav, to walk in God's ways. And the rabbis tell us that to walk in God's ways is to do the things that God did. So, for example, God, just as God visited the sick, so shall we too visit the sick. Just as God buried the dead, so too shall we bury the dead. Just as God comforted mourners, so too shall we comfort mourners. So walking in God's ways means doing. It's a process, and so literally, because it comes from the word meaning to walk. Halicha means to walk, and so halacha, which again is mistranslated as Jewish law, really means the way of doing things, the way Jews do Jewish, and that's a very expansive term. Halacha covers everything. Or in some traditional circles, you will hear, what's the halacha of this? What's the specific law of that? And so it's an expansive term that covers everything. And really, it's about the doing. It's about the process in which we walk through being Jewish, right? To use the literal meaning of the word, right? To walk in God's ways. So very important term. So any of the praxis of doing Jewish is halacha, and that can manifest itself in all sorts of ways. Often you'll hear about in English the halachic process, meaning are you doing something that has been thought out through the process of the Jewish legal tradition and Jewish legal interpretation. And as we saw in the very first session, that halacha, Jewish law, or the process of doing Jewish, is pretty ancient. It goes back really to the earliest law codes of the Mishnah, and then the expansion in the Talmud, and then written in law codes, and then how those law codes expanded with commentaries, then contracted when people just wanted to know what to do, and then expanded again because people made commentaries, and then contracted again because people just wanted to know what to do. And in the modern period, within the last 150, 200 years or so, that has morphed from law codes into responsa. So in observant communities and Orthodox communities, you will have maybe one rabbi or one rabbi in particular who is well esteemed in the Orthodox world, or in this Orthodox community or that Orthodox community, write responsa to questions that he's been asked, and will use the basis of tradition and all the halachot that have come before to give a practical answer to a problem that somebody has. And that can cover all sorts of aspects of life. In the liberal traditions, in the conservative and reform movement and in Reconstructionist movement, there are committees that specifically in the conservative movement, there's the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. In the reform movement, they have a similar committee who write responsa, and so they can, you write it's not so much that people ask questions and write in questions to the law committees per se, but if an issue comes up and there's an important question, like as expansive as using electricity on Shabbat on the one end, and the inclusion of gay and lesbian rabbis on the other, right, in the modern era. Then these committees will again go through the depths of tradition and researching the halachot on the particular issues, and taking those into account and taking the modern sensibilities into account, will issue a decision, and that all is part of the halachic process. It's not just right. We don't just make decisions willy-nilly saying, oh, I like that, let's do that, but basing yourself in the halachic process, that the 2,000-year-old process, and even earlier, because if we go back to the origins of the Bible 3,000 years ago, we're part of a process. And it's kind of an oxymoron to say halachic process, because the word halacha means the same thing as process, the way of doing, the process of doing. So that's halacha writ large. Then another important topic I want to talk about, important term I want to talk about, is mitzvot. So the word mitzvah literally means commandment. This word appears all over the Torah, and it is its root word means command. And even in modern Hebrew, when you're talking about grammatical tenses, tzivui is the command, right? Tzivui mitzvah. So it's commandment. It's about it's the noun form of what this thing is. It is a mitzvah. We are commanded to do these things. Excuse me. And the reason we are commanded to do these things is because there is a commander, right? In the most traditional understanding, God is the commander and we are the commanded. Excuse me. And in that sense, right, God gives us the mitzvot, and we, in being in relationship with God and accepting the mitzvot upon ourselves because we are in a relationship with God, fulfill the obligations of the mitzvot. And this is the most this is the kind of the standard rabbinic way of understanding this. And again, this word could be mitzvah, could be one particular commandment, or it could be the collective noun, the mitzvah, like the collective noun of all of these. Of course, there's also mitzvot, the plural of this. Now, you might have heard and read that there are 613 mitzvot in the Torah, a very famous number. That number is actually a midrash. That number is a rabbinic legend that was concocted by the rabbis with a bit of gematria. So gematria, if you've heard of that, that's numerology. And so what the rabbis do, they tell this really brilliant midrash, where and it's very astute how they point this out, where they say, they have this verse in Deuteronomy that says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. We actually sing that verse when we lift the Torah and put the Torah away at the end of the Torah service on a Shabbat or a festival morning. Torah, 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 Torah tziva lanu Moshe. And so they say Torah tziva lanu Moshe, which means Torah was commanded, tziva, mitzvah, Torah tziva lanu. Torah was commanded to us by Moses, or Moses commanded us the Torah. Okay, Moses commanded us the Torah. And the Torah, I'm explaining this midrash, the word Torah is the letters of the word Torah have numerical equivalents. And so Tav is 400, and Vav is 6, and Resh is 200, and Hey is 5. So if you had 6 and 5, and 400 and 200, you get 611. 611, right? That's Torah. Torah is the number 611. But if you think about it carefully, we go right back to the book of Exodus. God actually speaks 2 of the mitzvot. God says, I am Adonai your God, and you shall have no other gods before me. The rest are commanded by the mouth of Moses, which is why they take this verse, Torah tziva lanu. Moses commanded us the Torah. But God, specifically in the first person, utters 2 of them. And 611 plus 2 is 613. So that's how we get to 613. It's a nice little midrash. And of course, later commentators try to go back and count all the 613 mitzvot in the Torah. People have different lists. It's, again, they're basing themselves on a midrash. It's cute. It's nice. It gives us a good number. A meaningful number. Excuse me. A meaningful number, but really, it's a midrash. What's interesting, if we look specifically at the Torah itself, many of the commands in the Torah are not applicable to us at all because they are specifically limited to the temple. So tons of, I would say hundreds, more than half, or maybe it's less than that. I can't remember the exact number. But a sizable portion of the mitzvot are inoperable or not applicable because they are limited to temple sacrifice and temple procedure. So we don't do those. What's even more interesting is that, of course, they're not 613 because the categories of the mitzvot in the Torah are not what we do. We do so many others that have been added on by tradition. So we have really thousands if you want to think about it. And there are lots of quote unquote mitzvot that we do that are not commanded in the Torah at all. So for example, lighting Shabbat candles. We say that's a mitzvah, but that's not in the Torah. Torah never says light Shabbat candles. Even better, lighting Hanukkah candles. Hanukkah is not even a holiday in the Torah. But we are commanded to light Hanukkah candles. The rabbis kind of institute that along. And so the Torah itself is not specifically list 613, nor does it nor is it limited to those, because we have an expansive amount that have been added on by tradition. Now, what I want to do next is talk about a different understanding of mitzvot. So mitzvah literally means commandment. It is the thing from the commander to the commanded. And we, as the people who have accepted this upon ourselves, respond to the divine call with these mitzvot. And that there's a Hasidic tradition that says that the word mitzvah is actually related, and they know they're doing wordplay with this, but it's meaningful, powerful wordplay. That the word mitzvot comes from litzavot, which is an Aramaic word which means to connect. And so what the Hasidic tradition tells us is that mitzvot are opportunities to connect with God. And they, the early Hasidic movement, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, was a pietistic movement. It was a return to the masses. It was non-legalistic. And so what they were saying is that mitzvot are not specifically commandments that you are commanded, but they are opportunities to connect. It's litzavot. It's this Aramaic word that means connection. I like that. I think that's really powerful. That it's right that mitzvot are certainly they are commanded, but they are points of connection. And if we do not believe, as most moderns do not believe in a commanding God, I think it's more palatable to us that maybe instead of translating it as commandments, we translate it as commitments, that we are committing ourselves to these practices because we accept upon ourselves our relationship with God and our and the practices of the Jewish people. And so that's one of the ways, and I talked about this last week. One of the ways that that Kaplan talked about this, thought about mitzvot, was mitzvot are the folk ways of the Jewish people. It's the things that Jews do. And so mitzvot take upon their own their own character as points of connection. Now there are two categories of mitzvot. Mitzvot ben adam lemakom, mitzvot ben adam lechavero, which means mitzvot between a person and God, and mitzvot between a person and between human beings. And so what that means, and how I would translate that into more colloquial language, is ritual mitzvot and interpersonal mitzvot. That there are ritual mitzvot that we do at that on particular holidays, and particular, and these are specifically Jewish. The ritual mitzvot are, lighting Shabbat candles and sitting in a sukkah and and all the little things we do at a Passover Seder, and making kiddush, reciting the blessing over the wine on Friday nights. There are, hearing the sound of the shofar. All these are ritual mitzvot that are part of the ritual life of the Jewish people. And then there are interpersonal mitzvot, which are the ethical responsibilities that are due towards our fellow human beings. To act with compassion and kindness, and to serve our fellow human beings, and relieve oppression and ailment and things like that. So two categories of mitzvot. A couple more things I want to say about this. These two categories are really interesting in how in the distinctions that they have between each other. It's only the ritual mitzvot that we say blessings over. We do not say blessings over the interpersonal mitzvot. And in Hebrew, it's the first 6 words, standard blessings, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, followed by Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. So, blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe. That's the first 6 words. Who has made us holy with commandments and commanded us to whatever we're about to do. Those are, in almost any case that we do a ritual mitzvah, we say that blessing. But we don't say blessings over the interpersonal mitzvot. I think it's fascinating. People have posited many different reasons why. The reason why, the reason that most resonates with me, that I'll share right now, is that the interpersonal mitzvot, the ethical mitzvot, are ends unto themselves. And if you help someone, if you relieve someone's pain, if you work to make their life better, that is an end unto itself. It does not necessarily need the intention of it doesn't necessarily need the what's called kavanah. We'll get to that in a later session, but the inner intention, the end is itself enough. You're helping somebody, and if they're helped, if you do it, that's it. That's the intention. For ritual mitzvot, we have to focus ourselves, right? We have to be engaged in the focusing on the intention of what we're about to do, and the way we do that is by reciting a blessing. We say those words, they connect us to the moment, they connect us to the act, they connect us to God, and we do it. So the intention is all there because we're doing that thing, we're doing that specifically Jewish thing that is asked of us by God, or to take it from the other perspective, we're doing that specifically Jewish thing that we are engaging with because we want that connection with God. First thing I wanted to say. Second thing I wanted to say about this is about Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur, which we'll get to later when we speak about the festivals, Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, the day of confession and introspection. And several times on Yom Kippur, we list a series of failings, that we haven't done X, Y, and Z, and we're confessing that. And Yom Kippur liturgy opens with the statement, for transgressions against God, Yom Kippur atones. For transgressions against our fellow human being, Yom Kippur does not atone until we have made peace with the other person. And throughout this entire list of confessions that we do multiple times a day, it's all about how we have failed in our relationships with other people. We never on Yom Kippur confess that about the ritual mitzvot. We don't say, God, I have sinned against you for not lighting Shabbat candles. God, I have sinned against you for not, shaking the lulav. God, I have sinned against you by not attending a Passover Seder, or not hearing the sound of the shofar last week, right? So we never confess for ritual mitzvot. So God understands. If we don't do those, God understands. We should do those. They fulfill our lives, and they are distinctly Jewish practices. But what we confess about are the fact that we haven't acted responsibly with our fellow human beings. I think it's a really powerful statement about what Yom Kippur is all about, and how these two categories of mitzvot are different, right? We should be doing ritual mitzvot, but if we don't, God doesn't need our confession about that. Two categories of mitzvot. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. Any questions about the two ideas that I talked about, halacha and mitzvah? So I want to move on specifically to the two big categories of mitzvot that I want to speak about tonight. And the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about all sorts of mitzvot, but two tonight. And for those of you who I spoke to several weeks ago at that first in-person meeting, I mentioned these two. And the two I want to speak about are Shabbat and Kashrut, like the Sabbath, the day of rest, and Jewish dietary laws. And I want to talk about these two for several reasons. First off, these are the two main ways that you can tell somebody's Jewish, right? These are the two really distinctive factors about being Jewish: what people do on Shabbat and what foods they put in their mouth. As I talked about this the last several weeks, that when writers, when non-Jewish writers would make observations about the Jews, they would say things like, oh, they don't work one day in seven, or they refrain from eating certain foods, right? These are noticeable things. And so that's an ancient observation. And it's still very obvious today in that, especially for observant Jews, you can tell like that's their major distinctive feature. That's the major distinctive feature from Jews from non-Jews. And also it becomes obvious when you consider observant Jews who take who really engage with the seriousness and sense of obligation when it comes to halakha. And that there are all sorts of categories regarding Shabbat that you're not supposed to do, and ways of eating regarding kashrut. And what's so interesting about these two, again, the biggest, most self-identifying concepts or mitzvot, categories of mitzvot, is that there is scant evidence for them in the Torah. In fact, the rabbis admittedly say that Shabbat is a mountain hanging by a thread. They specifically use that metaphor because they know there's like nothing in the Torah about Shabbat. Basically, there's little sprinklings here and there. You shouldn't work on Shabbat. Okay. What does work mean? We'll get to that. And other anecdotal evidence like don't light a fire, or that the Israelites didn't collect bread, didn't collect manna on the seventh day. And of course, the idea of resting on the seventh day comes from two places in the Torah, and specifically the two versions of the Ten Commandments, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy, where one says, "Rest on the seventh day because God rested after 6 days of creation." Right? God created for 6 and rested on the seventh, and also rest on Shabbat. Do no work on Shabbat because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And those two explanations for Shabbat are actually part of our Friday evening kiddush, the blessing over the wine of the grape juice. That those two statements are intertwined into the blessing itself. Besides that, that's about all that the Torah says about Shabbat. The rabbis create an entire edifice of Shabbat observance, things you should not do and things that you should do. The things that you should not do are, of course, a lot more. And the way they do this is really fascinating. First off, again, they admit that Shabbat is a mountain hanging by a thread because it's of all of the laws. I mean, the section of the Talmud, the Masechet Shabbat, the section of the Talmud about Shabbat, is massive. It's one of the longest sections on the in the Talmud, and there are 39 categories of work that are forbidden on Shabbat. And the way they derive this is that they connect it with the Mishkan. They connect it with the portable sanctuary that the Israelites built as God's home during their wanderings. And they directly correlate this. And I think it's a fascinating correlation because the work that it takes to build sacred space is the work that you cannot do for sacred time. They have this direct correlation. The work that was done to create sacred space is the work that you specifically cannot do to create sacred time, which is what Shabbat is. It's sacred time. If you haven't read Heschel's Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, The Sabbath, read it. It's phenomenal. It's just it gives a theology and a philosophy of Shabbat that is just exquisite poetry. And he calls it a palace in time. That it is a moment, it is a series of moments of time for separation from the world, where we do creative acts all week long, and Shabbat is our time to remove ourselves from the creative acts and focus on the important things: family, friends. It forces us to disconnect from the world. And in our world today, we need that disconnection. We need to disconnect in that way. And so the way that Shabbat is often, unfortunately, looked at is a burden. I can't do any of this stuff. It's a lot of stuff. It's 39 categories of work, and each of those categories has all sorts of derivatives. So one of the things is, the observant traditions is that you can't spend money on Shabbat. Why can't you spend money on Shabbat? Nothing wrong with money. Well, the issue with money is that when you spend money, someone is going to write down a transaction, right? You can't spend money without somebody writing down a transaction, and writing is forbidden on Shabbat. Writing is the creative work. So you can look up all the 39 creative activities, but we have all sorts of, there's categories, and then there's subcategories, and there's other categories of what's called, so there's malachot, there's av malachot, there's the major categories, there are minor categories, and there are muktzah, the other things that are incidental, things that you shouldn't do because it might lead you to, it's like you shouldn't even pick up a pencil. You shouldn't pick up a pencil because it might lead you to write, right? So, another observant traditional way of looking at this is, that you shouldn't bathe yourself. Why shouldn't you bathe yourself? Because you might come to wring out your towel that's wet, and you can't wring out a towel. So that's why you shouldn't bathe yourself. You should take a shower before Shabbat begins, Friday afternoon. But that's the reasoning. And so there's all these categories. We don't have to get into the minutia. I just gave you a couple of details there. But the purpose of not doing any of these things, of not doing the halachot, these laws, is so that you can do anything else, right? If you can't do, there's lots of things you can't do, which limits you to do all the other things that you can do, which means like to rest and to be at home and to be with family and to walk and to enjoy the world. And so it's limiting the creative work that we do so that we are not creative, but we are receptive to what is around us. Now, things certainly get interesting in the modern era because we have all sorts of technology that does things for us. And we have things like electricity. And it's fascinating. I won't go deeply into it, but the electricity argument is really interesting. Because when it was first invented or first discovered, when it was first discovered, you have and it's brought to traditionalist rabbis. They say no, electricity is like fire, and so we can't use it because we don't like fires. We don't start fires. But it turns out it's not, right? It's more like water in your faucet. It's not like something you start, it's something that's always there. You just use some mechanisms to harness it. And so different more, and modern movements have figured out new ways to live a halachic Shabbat still using electricity, like your refrigerator is plugged in, your air conditioning, right? Those other things. What sort of creative work do you do with electricity? So there's all sorts of interesting conversations that go on with that. Modern movements, of course, the conservative movement wrote a response in the 50s saying that driving was okay, even though your car starts starts with ignition, with lighting a spark. And they do that and they do some really, really creative reading to say why that's okay. Driving is okay for purposes of celebrating Shabbat in community in a synagogue or going to someone's house and things like that. So that's that can get very interesting in those conversations. Now, for me and for many liberal Jews who are not observant in this way, there's the added question of how do we celebrate a meaningful Shabbat that is not in the most traditional observant kind of way. That's a good question, right? What can we, if we're not going to shut everything off, if we're, we live in a world where we don't live in communities that are walking distance, how do we navigate that? And I would direct your attention to Art Green's book, Judaism's 10 Best Ideas. I assign that specifically later on in the course, but he has a wonderful chapter on Shabbat, and he gives basically 10 steps to a meaningful Shabbat, 5 do's and 5 don'ts. Things like, things like, bring in Shabbat with kiddush and motzi, and spend time with friends, read a book, do something edifying. Don't spend money, don't travel, long distances. Don't watch canned entertainment. Well, and certainly not halachic in the most observant sense. It's a nice framework for how to live a meaningful modern Shabbat. So I would certainly encourage that. And I think it's a good guide. And for those of you who are in the conversion process, and we'll speak about this much later, and I mentioned this at our first meeting, I want you to develop a Shabbat practice. And that does not mean, although it can if you really wanted to, but it certainly does not mean observing Shabbat to its strictest sense, but finding a space, finding a way to celebrate Shabbat in a distinct way that you would not do the rest of the week, making Friday night and maybe and Saturday different than your routine, bringing it in with ritual or spending time with family or doing a family kind of family-centered home activity. Again, it's important. And as I mentioned before, Shabbat is it's a rational thing, right? We need a break. We need to step away from the world. We need to disconnect one day in 7. And so it's meaningful, it's purposeful, it's rational, it creates that space, and it is it is a cornerstone of Jewish practice. It's one of those things. How can you tell who's Jewish? They keep Shabbat. This is what they do, right? How you can see who these people are. One of my teachers tells this story of this happened, I don't know, 75 years ago or so, or 100 years ago or so. I can't remember which one of my teachers was telling us, but his grandmother knew that she could trust the kosher butcher in town because he was Shabbat observant. Right. So that marker of Shabbat observance said, okay, everything else counts too, right? And that's still the case for many Jews today who are Shabbat observant. One of the things that one of the distinctions I like to make that is really crucial is based on the two different versions of the Ten Commandments as they appear in the Torah. So the version in the book of Exodus says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day. And the one in Deuteronomy says, Shamor et HaShabbat, guard or keep the Sabbath day. And these inform terms that are used today. So someone says they are Shomer Shabbat, which means they are Sabbath observant. They observe the traditions strictly of Shabbat. If you ever want to see a great, although not safe for work, description of this, watch The Big Lebowski. Because Lebowski's friend Walter converts to Judaism, and he talks about being Shomer Shabbos, and he's very adamant about being Shomer Shabbos. And those of you who are smiling, you know what I'm talking about. So you can go on YouTube and look up those clips of Walter saying that he's Shomer Shabbos and explaining how that manifests itself. He's a good representation of observant Jew, but not a good representation of a moral human being. That's a whole different conversation for another time. So being Shomer Shabbat or Shomer Shabbos is about keeping all the strictures. But I like to go to the other citation, Zachor, right? Zocher. So Zachor means remember. It's the positives, the do's, not the don'ts. It's observe the Sabbath. It's refrain from it's remember. It's the act of doing. It's the act of resting. It's the act of marking that time. So am I Shomer Shabbat? No, but I'm Zocher Shabbat. Right? I always intentionally do something that is a Shabbat activity with my family, whether that's Shabbat dinner or we have a tradition of watching a movie together on Friday night. So is that halachic? No, but it's our Shabbat thing. And we find some way on Saturday to do that as well. So I would encourage us not to get stuck on being Shomer Shabbat, but Zocher Shabbat. Not necessarily the strictures, but the active doing of Shabbat. I'm going to stop there. Anybody have any questions about anything I spoke about relating to Shabbat?
I have a question.
Yeah, we'll start with Russell and Kelly.
Thank you. I work in a hospital, and so there are quite often a lot of Friday evening / Saturday mornings that I have to work. Because that is considered an act of service, is that then allowed to work on the Sabbath in that situation?
It's a good question. So yeah. So one of the things that overrides Shabbat is saving a life. So there are observant Jewish doctors who carry their beepers on Shabbat and keep their cell phones on, or if they're on call, and that's just what they have to do. There's the Israeli army operates on Shabbat because you have to, right? Defensive nation. So yes, I mean, if it's part of your job, then it's part of your job. And again, it's a negotiation. It's you have to figure out what's your balance, what's your comfort with your own lifestyle, but certainly to make that happen, right? That's a question of Zocher Shabbat as opposed to Shomer Shabbat. Yeah, great. Let's go with Greg. Your hand was up.
Yeah, you talked a lot about celebrations and around Shabbat within the family and friends, and kind of, excuse me. I know there's Shabbat service, of course, and your thoughts about how Shabbat service is integrated into just life, I guess, within that, because we talked about the celebrations at home and with friends and family, but that formal service of Shabbat.
Right. So, that's the way to do it with community, right? So, celebrating Shabbat with the community happens in synagogue, and then it happens at home. And so there are, certain rituals that we do in the synagogue. We have a service called Kabbalat Shabbat, the welcoming of Shabbat on Friday nights. That's a mystical tradition from, I mentioned this a couple of, last week or 2 weeks ago, that the mystics of Sfat invented. Right, Shabbat services are longer than they are, during the week, just because you have the time, and it's time to study Torah. It's time to read the weekly Torah portion, and to think about, and to spend some extra time in synagogue with community. And so again, it's a balance, and it's a negotiation. At Beth-El Zedek, we have some regulars who come every single Friday night and every single Saturday morning. And other people will do other things, and we have people who like to have Shabbat dinner at their homes on Friday nights, and they come Saturday mornings. And we like to have the people who come to services on Friday night and then go have Shabbat dinner wherever after services. And so again, it's a negotiation, but services at synagogue are about celebrating with community, in distinction from celebrating or in tandem with celebrating at home. Let's go with Trina and Joe. Let's go to you next. Let's unmute yourself. There you go.
Rabbi, if rituals connect us to a mitzvah, and so we're going to practice the rituals that we know to help us observe, speak a little bit about the actual doing, the observance of rituals, how they affect a person's belief and understanding of the mitzvah.
So that's a good question. I mean, in that respect, I think it's personal, right? That the doing of the mitzvah is what reinforces the belief. That I actually think the doing comes before the understanding, right? If we go back to the book of Exodus, where the Israelites receive the Torah, and they say in Exodus chapter 24, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen, or we will do and we will understand. So the doing comes first, and the doing comes first. I think the doing comes first because the doing helps us understand. The doing helps us believe. Our beliefs are not a catechism that just is a statement of faith. One of the founders of modern Orthodox Judaism, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, said the catechism of the Jew is the calendar. I mentioned that, I think, in our opening meeting, that we don't have beliefs, right? We do, and that informs our beliefs. So everything that we do connects us to something. It's not just, we believe we believe that our ancestors left Egypt. No, we do that. We reenact that on Passover. It's not just like that we say God rested. No, we rest too, like our ancestors rested and like God rested. So the doing creates a sense of belonging to a people, and a sense of connection with God. All right, Mark, you had a question.
Yeah, so just kind of, as you kind of talked about Shabbat, you kind of mentioned your own kind of routine. Well, I guess it's like you said, break from routine. It's like creating a different routine essentially
Yeah, it is.
for Shabbat. So like, I mean, I know there's the ritual side of it, which is going to services, but then there's the like observing, or is it did I say it? The
Zocher, like, yeah, the active,
Yeah.
the active, yeah.
So it's like essentially we could kind of create our own routine, like special routine on Friday or Saturday, and call that would differentiate us from kind of others. Like you're saying Shabbat differentiates Jews from non-Jews. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's part of it. There's several different aspects of the separation. One is that it separates our activities from the rest of the week, and also like what we choose to do separates us from the community around us, and in that respect, Shabbat, right, is a marker of identity. Look, yes, we can choose our own practice, but within, it's not about going to the mall and on a shopping spree. I think that's right. That's certainly against the spirit of Shabbat, but creating something in the home, it's like, let's do game night, or let's do, we have Shabbat dinner and we have a movie. And so it's something that edifies the family, something that's within the family. And it can be as simple as, saying the blessing over the wine, the blessing over the bread, and have dinner and then do something. But that moment is framed. First off, it's different than the rest of the week, and it's framed with the ritual blessings of Shabbat. Yeah. Alyssa, you had your hand up.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you follow like the specific candle lighting times? Like, do you like it gets like later and later, no, early and earlier into the winter, or do you just use like do every evening on Shabbat? Like, is that common to use specific times or just to go?
So for people who are observant, yes, they will follow. They've got a calendar on their fridge to say Shabbat times, or I got a calendar on their phones to say exact, time to light candles on Shabbat. We do not, in my family, especially in the winter. Or the winter it'd be way too early, and in the summer, it'd be like way after my kids go to bed because they're little. But we want them to experience that, and so we light the candles. When at the same time, we light the candles together around 5:20ish every Friday afternoon, because that's before I go to services. And it's when the kids are around and before the routine starts. So really it's about negotiating that, and I think that's a choice for modern liberal Jews to who want to have a somewhat traditional Shabbat, but also have their own practices and rhythms that don't necessarily conform to the specifics of halakha. All right, I want to shift gears, spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so talking about kashrut. One more question. Yeah, Cass.
Yeah, I don't know how to raise my hand in Zoom.
Okay.
But I was just wondering, since you don't adhere to a certain Shabbat calendar, in the Sabbath book, the forward, I guess, she was talking about how there was all of this hustle and bustle before Shabbat started, and then anything that remained undone would just remain undone. Do you have that feeling at the end of the week? Are there still things that you kind of leave for after Shabbat?
Sometimes, but definitely there's the feeling of we got to get it all done. There's a whole bunch of stuff we got to get done before Shabbat comes in. But before we light the candles and officially begin dinner and all that. So yes, there's the crazy.
I was just curious about that. So
yeah, definitely there's that feeling. So I want to talk about kashrut, because it's another marker of distinction and a significant one. And this goes and as rational as Shabbat is, kashrut is irrational. There's no logic to the dietary laws. In addition to which, there's very little in the Torah. There's a little bit more than about Shabbat. The Torah says there are forbidden. There are birds you can eat and birds you can't eat. There are creeping things that you can eat and creeping things you can't eat. Grasshoppers are apparently and locusts are apparently kosher. So if you want to eat grasshoppers, you could do that. There are things that swim that you can eat. They must have fins and scales, and the things that swim that don't have fins and scales, you cannot eat. Land animals have to chew their cud and have split hooves. And there's also a statement about not cooking a kid in its mother's milk, but that's very vague and not really sure what that means. Beyond that, the tradition has created a huge edifice of dietary practice you have to wait between eating meat after after eating dairy you can eat meat, but after meat you have to wait to eat dairy. Why? I don't know. There's really no logical reason for that. You actually digest meat much quicker than you digest dairy. So biologically, physically, doesn't make any sense. Meat you digest in like no time. Dairy takes like hours and hours to get through your system. It's one of the reasons why some people are lactose intolerant, because actually dairy is very difficult to digest for a lot of human beings. Separate dishes, separate everythings, like that is certainly not in the Torah. That is something that has been created by the edifice of halakha. And as I said, there's certainly more in the Torah about eating. And these are ancient practices, mind you. So archaeologists, fascinating stuff. Archaeologists are excavating parts of the land of Israel through certain layers of history going back 3,000 years, have in Israelite settlements, no pig bones. If you look in surrounding settlements where the Philistines lived or where other peoples lived, pig bones. So this ancient tradition of refraining from pork is really, really ancient. Like it's an ancient practice of the Jews, of the Israelites. And what is it ultimately? It's a marker of distinction. Because if you can't eat with somebody, you can't socialize with somebody. And if you can't socialize with somebody, you can't hang out with them and marry into their clans, and you keep your clan separate. So ultimately, kashrut is a marker of distinction. How we want to play that distinction out is, varies in certain ways, but really it's Jewish eating, I'll say it this way: there's always going to be somebody who's not going to want to eat at your house. Meaning, as strictly kosher as you think you keep your house, there's always going to be somebody who won't eat there because they're stricter. So meaning like, it's that's a conversation too. That's a negotiation. I've an expression I've also heard is keep your eyes on your own plate, right? That we all have our own practices and of what Jewish eating is. Some people don't eat pork or shellfish. Some people are vegetarian or vegan. If you're a vegetarian, no problems, right? You're not going to eat any meat whatsoever. If you're a pescatarian, if you just eat fish, right, stay away from the shellfish and the things like that. It's Jewish eating, and there's no logical reason for it other than I'm choosing to do this. And while that used to be a weird thing, it's not so weird anymore in the sense that we all have all these different diets. Some people are gluten-free, some people are dairy-free, some people don't eat meat, some people are vegan, some people don't eat eggs, some people don't eat this. People have allergies to certain things. So the idea of a varied or unique diet is not so controversial anymore. And so when the idea that we choose the foods and our foods intentionally is something that again doesn't sound so controversial. And when I say it's Jewish eating, it means that and that every time we look, we need to eat, right? Eating sustains us, and eating keeps us alive, and eating is also fun and good and it engages the senses in all sorts of fun ways. But can we do it Jewishly, right? Can we, anytime we put something, we're preparing a dish and we put it in front of ourselves to eat, do we think to ourselves, I'm doing this because I'm Jewish, right? I'm doing this because I'm a Jew and I'm eating the way Jews should be eating. however you define that in that way. Um, bacon wrapped scallops, that's not a Jewish way to eat, right? So right there are choices that we make. And this is something for those of you who are converting that, excuse me, I've also said, find a Jewish eating practice. No judgment, not going to make a judgment on that, but find a Jewish eating practice that conforms to your life, that hopefully is a choice and is a little bit different from what you're doing. But do you have to have separate meat and dairy pots and pans and dishes? Maybe, if that's the way you want to go. In my house, we have separate dishes and separate pots and pans, but I use the same sponge for meat and dairy. I use the same dishwasher for meat and dairy. Some people don't do that. Like just for dinner this evening, we had like a chicken bean chili, and my daughters wanted dessert, but they knew they couldn't have chocolate. So we went into their Halloween candy, and they got some like Airheads or Jolly Ranchers or something. Right. So then they know, and that's that this is how we do things in our house. They really love when we have fish, because that means that they get to have chocolate or like a yasso. Yeah, yasso bars. We love yasso bars in our house. Greek yogurt bars, great stuff. Anyway, so like they or ice cream or something like that. So and they know that like that's how we do things in our house, because that's Jewish eating. And so look, you can look up all the particulars. I'm not going to go into the particulars of that if you're cooking a meat dish and a drop of milk falls in, you can actually nullify that. It's not totally ruined. There's a concept called nullification of 1/60th. Again, very detailed. The laws of kashrut are actually very logical. But stepping into them is an illogical move, because it's just about the kishkis. It's just about what you feel in your gut, that you make the choice to be Jewish and to eat Jewishly. And again, that's a negotiation. That's a conversation. What is Jewish eating? It should certainly be guided by the principles of kashrut. I think, but the particulars, right, as I said, everybody does it differently in their own home, and everybody has different traditions and makes different choices. Greg, you have a question?
You gotta unmute yourself. My question is around like butter as a fat.
Around, I'm sorry, what?
Like butter as a fat to cook with.
Yeah.
So, like, is it based on kind of what you've been talking about and kind of my experience with eating a Jewish diet, but I had never thought about it till now that, butter is dairy, right? It's butter, right?
It's milk.
But like, so does that mean we need to focus on using more, like, and it depends, right? Your question is going to be, it depends, but like beef with a fat, like vegetable oil or something like that to cook with, but it's okay to use butter with poultry or fish?
So there's non-dairy butter out there.
Well, yeah, that's true.
There's right. We use non-dairy butter a lot. And so you bring up an interesting point that poultry, right? They don't suckle their young. But Jewish law has determined that poultry is also forbidden with dairy. Fish and dairy are okay. Poultry and dairy, no, not okay. But they make non-dairy everything now. We get like non-dairy cheese. So like my daughter, one of her favorite dishes, we make chicken parmesan, and she's like, "Can we have chicken with pretend cheese?" So like, you know, she knows that it's not real. So she asks for chicken and pretend cheese. And it's like the Daya non-dairy mozzarella slices, and we have like dairy, the non-dairy cheddar shreds that we like make cheesy polenta. It's really good, non-dairy. But yeah, so there are options. Yeah. And again, it's not so strange because, you know, people have dairy allergies or people have a non-dairy, you know, diet. And so like tonight we had this chicken and bean chili thing that we put non-dairy sour cream in. Is it the same as sour cream? No, of course not. But it's like it works. But again, it's intentional Jewish eating. It's intentional Jewish eating. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mark.
Yeah, so my wife and I have talked about this before. She talked about like these rules being very intentional, especially with like pork from like it wasn't clean, and that was always the thing that she had kind of mentioned, that it wasn't clean, it wasn't healthy, and that's the reason that pork was just not a part of the Jewish diet. Now, I mean, I know like we've come a long way in food cleanliness over the last hundreds of years, and maybe I'm totally wrong. Like the rules of kind of what you had mentioned earlier is very logical, and there was like a really health specific reason why things were kept out. Is that more like, is that just logically thinking that way, or is it kind of where you said it, you're just doing it because you need to be different? Like you said, it's not logical.
It's not. So and I'll tell you. So pork is no less clean than any other animal. Right. You know, the thing about pork is, you know, the myth of pork being less clean is the myth we told ourselves. And because you know, the Romans, they love pork. They love pork. They ate pork with everything. And you know, they were the strongest people in the ancient world. They you know, kicked the snot out of everybody and conquered everybody. And you know, just like every other meat, if you cook it, it's clean, right? And so the idea, so the thing with the pig is that there's a couple of reasons. One, because non-Jews knew that Jews did not eat pig. They used pig to torture us. So that became an even bigger violation. And number two, the pig is a crafty or at least misleading animal, because the pig has split hooves. So on the outside, it looks like it's kosher, but it doesn't chew its cud. So the pig is a deceptive animal, and even more so, it's been forbidden. So the pig is no less not kosher than like horse or camel, but because of its associations with persecution and what non-Jews forced upon Jews throughout the ages, it has this extra connotation of being really, really bad. But as far as meal preparation, like, you know, if your neighbor's serving ham and you're serving chicken, there's nothing more healthy or unhealthy about that particular meal.
So it's kind of like, at this point, it's almost like it's very historical in nature now, because like you said, if there's like just a bad connotation in Jewish history with pork, it's regardless of, because like my question prior to you kind of going into that was, or like the follow-up was like, was the healthiness created to justify the rule, or was it unhealthy thought of that way and that's why? Right. After the fact. Certainly after the fact. Yeah. Certainly after the fact. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yep. Allie, you had a question that you wrote in, it looks like. Lamb is kosher. Oh yeah, lamb, definitely kosher. Think about Passover, the Paschal lamb. We sacrifice tons of lambs. Lamb's definitely kosher. Chews its cud, split hooves. Lamb is really good too. Get yourself a nice lamb shoulder. Oh,
It melts in your mouth. Good stuff. Good stuff. Cass has a question.
Yeah, so you had said that there are some things that you don't do because they're not in the spirit of Shabbat, like they're not necessarily strictly prohibited, like picking up a pen, but because it could cause you to do something that's not allowed. So my question is, so like, how would eating like fake butter or fake cheese like be in this? Is it different because it's like a different type of law, that it's not, you're not following the spirit of kashrut, you're following like, I don't know, I'm just not understanding the distinction.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the most part, that wouldn't specifically apply. I think this. So for the most part, right, using non-dairy derivative or not non-dairy alternatives is seemingly okay. What's very interesting, I read this recently, is that observant rabbis and Orthodox rabbis made and you could look this up because it happened like last year, made a decision about the Impossible Burger, right? And what do you do with the Impossible Burger, right? Because it's seemingly, there's no meat. And some rabbis said that it was not appropriate to eat because it looks too much like a real burger. Same thing with there are some like things like bacon bits that are not, but some people but are not given a kosher, not given a hechsher, meaning they're kosher, they're hechsher, proper to eat, okay to eat for observant Jews. Some are. I can't remember how that distinction is made, but there is, for the most part, that doesn't play a role, but in some cases it certainly does. That I don't know. I would have no problem eating an Impossible Burger.
Because I mean, you can have a kosher cheeseburger with fake cheese, but then you can't have a fake burger with.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the particulars. You could certainly look it up. You could look like Google Impossible Burger and kosher, and you could find all the arguments there. It's really, but for the most part, I think the distinction between the spirit of Shabbat and the spirit of kashrut, I don't necessarily think that is exactly a one-to-one equivalent. Although there are, like I said, there are certain cases where that's an issue.
Okay, thanks.
Let's go to Greg.
Yeah, I had a question. You talked about sacrificing all of the lambs and how you love lamb, but like in Passover with the Seder plate, I believe it's sheep horn or bone. It's
Shank bone.
Yeah, shank bone. That's from a lamb, right? Or is that from a sheep?
Well, it ideally should be from a lamb.
Okay.
Some people use another kind of bone, like a chicken bone. Sometimes if you're living in an area where you really can't get a lamb bone. But yeah, the lamb was the was the central feature of the Passover sacrifice in during temple times. And yeah, the lamb bone, the shank bone is a feature of the Passover Seder as a remembrance of the Paschal offering. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, unrelated, but it caught my attention. I was like, wait.
Yeah, no worries. Trina and Joe.
Rabbi, if someone wishes to have to consult an authority, the rabbinic board, I've looked at the rabbinic board of Chicago, and there's a rabbinic board that declares every year, yes, this is in, this is out. Is there some board that a person, other than, the very observant, the Hasidim, would call your rabbi? You have to, check with your rabbi, but nobody's going to be checking with you or Rabbi Dennis 24/7 because you're not. So what board would you suggest? Is there a board at the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism or something
so,
like?
Yeah, so there are you can look and, you go to your grocery store. There are lots of different kosher symbols. There's there's OU, there's K, there's star K, there's a bunch of others. There's, some of these are national boards, some of these are local rabbinic authorities. And within the Orthodox movement, there are some questions about the authority of some of these. Personally, I would say that if somebody's making a good faith effort to put a hechsher on something, then I'm okay with that. Some people will only eat cheese or dairy products that specifically has a hechsher on them. Others say any cheese is okay. And so you can really get into the weeds with some of this stuff. But I'm of the opinion that especially regarding any kosher symbol, that's a good faith effort. Then there's also the term glatt kosher, and glatt kosher applies specifically to meat. That glatt means that it's perfect. There's been fully inspected, that there's nothing. It's a perfect. It's been there's no blemishes whatsoever. It's absolutely above board. And then some people use the term glatt kosher cheese, and that's just an oxymoron because glatt only applies to meat. So it's like, that they don't know what they're talking about. Russell and Kelly.
I was just curious how, what do you do if you need to go out to eat? What's the plan there? Because you're not gonna find kosher meat, but
so you draw your distinctions, and everybody makes it. Everybody has their own distinctions of what they will and won't eat in different places. Some people will eat anything. Some people say, I'm only going to eat dairy vegetarian out. Some people say I'm only going to eat chicken out. It all depends. Right. And so just to go back for a second, that kosher meat is meat that has been slaughtered in according to the specifications of rabbinic law by a kosher butcher. So some people won't eat meat out, but again, this is a really a negotiation. You figure out what's the best practice for you, and you stick with that, and try to be consistent with that, and try to make those choices. As I said, everybody's going to be different based on your own practice and your own comfort level. So some people keep a kosher home and eat whatever out, or eat dairy vegetarian out, or will eat fish out, because fish is not doesn't need to be slaughtered. Fish, you just pull it out of the water and that's it. So it's I'm not going to tell you exactly what you should do, but I think it should be informed, and it should be intentional and based in Jewish practice and come from Jewish frameworks. Okay, any other questions? All right. Excellent. So next week, I can't remember off the top of my head, we're either going to deal with the Jewish holidays or a Jewish life cycle. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it'll be one of those two topics. Whatever it says on the syllabus is next, and I'll consult that, of course, before class next week. As always, if you have any questions during the week, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, also, speaking of Shabbat, please feel free to start coming to Shabbat services Friday nights or Saturday mornings. We also do a Shabbat morning Torah study Saturday mornings before services. So if you want to start getting into that and learning about the weekly Torah portion and be part of that discussion, you're certainly welcome to to do that. So wish everybody a great week, and I'll see you soon.